It's a Tuesday morning. 8-year-old Ethan comes downstairs for breakfast and announces, "Mom, I got a 95% on my math test." His mom glances up from her phone for maybe 2 seconds, says, "That's nice," and goes right back to scrolling. Ethan waits for another 3 seconds. Nothing. He goes back up to his room, closes the door, and something inside him starts to die. You might not have noticed it. His mum certainly didn't. But Carl Jung would have. Because what just happened wasn't simple carelessness. It was programming, silent programming, the kind that molds narcissists without anyone noticing. No obvious trauma, no outright abuse, just repeated micro-moments, day after day, until the child is no longer a child, but a program running commands they never chose. In this video, you're going to discover how narcissists are shaped through silent programming happening in homes right now. First, the invisible microbehaviors that narcissistic parents repeat automatically, unconsciously. Second, how parental complexes are transmitted through unconscious identification in childhood. And third, the exact moment a child stops being themselves and becomes a programmed extension of their parents. I know what you might be feeling right now. That unsettling sense that maybe, just maybe, you didn't choose who you are. That your entire personality might just be a set of automatic responses programmed in childhood. That you're living someone else's life without even realizing it. You're not wrong. Jung called this unconscious identification with parental complexes, and it's exactly how narcissism takes root. Most people think narcissism comes from trauma, from abuse, from blatant neglect. But Jung discovered something far more disturbing. Narcissism is created through silent programming. Micro-behaviors, subtle patterns, automatic parental responses that the child absorbs without question. And here's the scariest part. Parents who create narcissists often have no idea they're doing it. They're just repeating what was done to them. Ethan didn't know any of this at 8 years old. All he knew was that something felt wrong, that a 95% wasn't enough, that he wasn't enough. But let's rewind, because Ethan's programming didn't start that Tuesday morning. It started much earlier. On the day he was born, when his mother looked at him and saw not a baby, but an opportunity to fix her own wounded childhood. When Ethan was 11 months old, he cried because he was hungry. His mum was on the phone with a friend. She looked at Ethan, shushed him with her finger, and Ethan stopped crying. In that moment, something was programmed. Your needs are inconvenient interruptions. Wait. Adapt, disappear. When Ethan was 2.5, he spilled his juice on the floor. An accident. His mom sighed loudly and said, "Ethan, can't you do anything right?" He was 2.5. But the programming took hold. You are defective. You need to be perfect to be acceptable. When Ethan was 4, he drew a dinosaur and showed it to his dad. His dad glanced at it for 1 second, said, "Cool," and went back to his computer. Ethan stood there holding the drawing, waiting. His dad didn't look again. Ethan crumpled the paper and threw it in the trash. Programming installed. Your achievements don't matter unless they generate a visible reaction. You need to do more, be more, to be seen. And so it went. Micro moment after micro moment, year after year, until Ethan at 8 years old was no longer really Ethan. He was a set of programmed responses to survive in an emotional environment where he was never seen as a separate person, where he existed only as an extension of his parents' unmet needs. Jung would say, Ethan is developing unconscious identification with the maternal complex. But let's translate that. Ethan is becoming an exact copy of his mother's unconscious patterns. He's not learning from what she says. He's absorbing what she does. And what she does repeatedly is treat Ethan as an object whose value depends on performance. At 10 years old, Ethan got straight A's on all his tests. His mom said, "Very good, son." And for the first time in weeks, she smiled at him. Ethan felt something: relief, validation, existence. So he concluded, "I only exist when I'm perfect." And the programming solidified. At 12 years old, Ethan was at the top of his class, best student, best athlete, student leader, and completely empty inside. Because every achievement was just a desperate attempt to generate that rare moment where his mother truly saw him. Not as her son, but as a trophy that validated her as a successful mother. Jung observed that children don't have the capacity to separate who they are from who their parents need them to be. So the child makes an unconscious Faustian bargain. "I'll kill who I am to become who you need." And Ethan made that bargain without words, without awareness, just automatic adaptation for psychological survival. And here comes the part that most people don't understand about narcissistic programming. It's not just about emotional invalidation. It's about something much more subtle and devastating. It's about the child being treated as a narcissistic extension of the parents, instead of a separate person with their own agency. Ethan's mom never hit him, never yelled, never called him stupid or useless. But she did something worse. She treated him as an object whose function was to generate positive feelings in her. When Ethan performed well, she felt like a good mother. When Ethan failed, she felt like a bad mother. So she unconsciously rewarded performance and punished failure, not with words, with micro-expressions, with the presence or absence of attention, with the quality of her gaze. And Ethan, like every child, was a natural reader of parental micro-expressions, because survival depends on it. So he learned to read every change in his mother's face, every tone of voice, every second of attention or inattention, and adjusted his behavior to maximize moments of validation and minimize moments of rejection. That's not conscious. It's programming, automatic, unconscious, installed before the child even has the language to question it. Jung called this the formation of a false self through identification with the parental persona. But what does that mean in practice? It means that Ethan developed an entire personality based not on who he was, but on who he needed to be to maintain connection with his mother. And that programmed personality became so automatic that Ethan, at 12 years old, could no longer distinguish between his real desires and his programmed ones. When the teacher asked, "Ethan, what do you want to be when you grow up?" Ethan answered, "A doctor." But he never chose medicine. He just absorbed that his mother valued prestigious professions, that she looked proud when he mentioned medicine, that her face lit up when he talked about Harvard. So Ethan unconsciously decided he wanted to be a doctor. But it wasn't his desire. It was the fulfillment of an installed program. And here's the devastating Jungian insight. Narcissism isn't excessive self-love. It's a total absence of a true self. It's living entirely as a program, running parental commands. Narcissistic grandiosity is a desperate compensation for the hole where a self should be. Ethan, at 14, was breaking academic records, president of the student council, captain of the debate team, and absolutely incapable of answering a simple question, "Who are you?" when you're not performing. Because he was never allowed to be. He was only allowed to do, and to do everything with excellence, always generating validation, always proving his worth, and in the process, the child that he was disappeared completely, replaced by a performance machine, programmed to seek external validation, because internal validation was never installed. Let's pause here, because you might be thinking, did my parents do this to me? And the answer is probably yes, to some degree. Because silent programming isn't the exception, it's the rule. Most parents treat their children as extensions instead of separate people, not out of malice, but out of unconsciousness, because they themselves were programmed that way. And here comes the most important Jungian revelation. Parental complexes are transmitted through generations, not by genetics, but by unconscious imitation. A child doesn't choose to absorb their parents' patterns. They automatically identify with them, because a child doesn't have a separate self yet. They're like a mirror, reflecting everything they see and internalizing it as if it were their own. Ethan's mother was programmed exactly like this by his grandmother. His grandmother treated his mother as an extension. His mother never processed this, never integrated it, never individuated. So she unconsciously replicated the same pattern with Ethan, not because she wanted to, but because her unresolved maternal complex automatically reproduced the dynamic she knew. Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." And that's exactly it. Ethan's mother was being directed by an unconscious maternal complex. She thought she was being a good mother, that she was encouraging excellence, that she was preparing her son for success. But in reality, she was just transmitting her own unhealed wound. And Ethan at 16 was a perfect machine. 4.0 GPA, accepted into Harvard, internships at hospitals, and completely dissociated from any real emotion, because emotions were treated as inconveniences since he was just a baby. So he learned to suppress them, to intellectualize them, to perform an acceptable version of himself, and bury the real version so deep that he himself couldn't access it anymore. This is narcissism, not self-love, but the murder of the true self and the compensatory inflation of the false self. Ethan didn't love himself. Ethan didn't even know who Ethan was. He only knew who he needed to be to maintain the illusion of connection with parents who never saw him as a separate person. And the programming continued. Because programming doesn't stop in childhood. It automatizes. It becomes the operating system. Ethan at 18 went to Harvard, and there he continued. Performance, excellence, external validation. But the internal emptiness grew, because the more he performed, the less he existed. The more he achieved, the less he knew who was achieving it. Jung would say, Ethan is living entirely from the persona. The true self was repressed into the shadow, and the inflated persona dominated consciousness. But the persona is a mask. It's not you. And living only from the mask is exhaustion. It's emptiness. It's eventual collapse. Hold on, because now comes the turn. That changes everything about silent programming. Ethan at 22 was in his third year of medical school at Harvard, top of the class, research published, a bright future. And he had a panic attack in the middle of anatomy class, the first of his life. He couldn't breathe, heart racing and certain he was going to die. He was taken to the ER, all the tests normal, diagnosis, panic attack. But Ethan didn't understand why. Everything was perfect. He was doing everything right, being everything he should be. And then the university therapist asked a question that broke the program. Ethan, what do you want? And Ethan couldn't answer, because he'd never considered the question. His whole life had been about what he should want, what his parents expected, what would generate validation. But what did Ethan want? He didn't know. And in that silence, something awoke, something buried for so long that Ethan didn't even know it existed. A small voice, weak, almost dead, saying, I don't want to be a doctor. I never did. And then Ethan collapsed, not physically, psychologically, because that small voice was revealing a devastating truth. He had lived 22 entire years as a program, not as a person. Every decision, every achievement, every moment of supposed pride, none of it was his. It was all the fulfillment of commands installed in childhood. Jung called this enantiodromia, the moment when the psyche can no longer live the lie and forces a confrontation with the truth. The inflated persona collapses, and the true self, buried in the shadow, emerges screaming, "Stop murdering me!" But let's understand what really happened to Ethan. Because silent programming isn't a metaphor. It's a literal process, neurological, psychological, that happens through specific mechanisms that Jung identified. First mechanism, unconscious identification. A child from 0 to 7 years old doesn't have the capacity to distinguish between I and other. So everything parents do, the child absorbs as if it were their own. Parents treat emotion as an inconvenience. The child internalizes. My emotions are an inconvenience. Parents value only performance. The child concludes, my value is my performance. And this doesn't happen through words. It happens through micro-expressions, tone of voice, quality of attention, presence or absence of delight in the parent's eyes. A child is constantly scanning their parents' faces, looking for signs of approval or rejection, and adjusting their behavior automatically. Second mechanism, formation of the adaptive false self. When a child realizes that their true self generates rejection and their false self generates approval, they choose survival. They kill the true self, inflate the false self, and eventually forget they even made that choice. The false self becomes their identity. The true self goes into the shadow, and the person lives entirely as an imposter without knowing it. Ethan did exactly this. At 4 years old, when his drawing was ignored by his father, something died. Genuine curiosity, spontaneous expression, the joy of creating, it died, and in its place was born a question: what do I need to do to be seen? And the answer was, be perfect, be more, achieve, perform. And Ethan performed for 18 years, non-stop, without questioning. Third mechanism, automatization of the complex. After years of repeating the same pattern, it stops being a conscious choice and becomes an autonomous complex. Jung discovered that complexes function like sub-personalities. They have a life of their own. They run automatically, no conscious thought necessary. Ethan's complex was, I only have value if I perform perfectly. And this complex ran 24 hours a day, directing every decision, every relationship, every moment of his existence. Ethan didn't choose to be a perfectionist. The complex chose for him. And here comes Jung's most disturbing insight. The majority of people live entirely dominated by complexes installed in childhood. They think they are making choices, but it's the complexes making the choices. They think they are living their own lives, but they are living a life programmed by their parents. And the parents are also dominated by complexes installed by their grandparents, which were installed by their great-grandparents, that were installed by generations before. A generational transmission of unconscious programming, a wound passed from father to son to grandson, without anyone choosing it, without anyone questioning it, until someone wakes up. And Ethan was waking up. But waking up is painful, because it means confronting the fact that you've lived your entire life as a lie, that the person you thought you were doesn't exist, that you need to start from scratch. At 22 years old, in the middle of Harvard, with an entire future planned based on a program you never chose, Jung said, neurosis is the suffering of a soul that hasn't found itself. and Ethan was in a deep neurosis. The panic attacks were his body screaming, "Stop! You are living someone else's life. You are killing who you are to be who they need you to be." But awakening isn't a cure, it's just the beginning. Because complexes don't disappear when you become aware of them. They resist, they fight, because they are ancient structures, deeply rooted, automated, and they have a function: psychological survival. Ethan developed the performance complex because it was the only way to maintain a connection with his parents. Letting go of the complex means facing the original terror. If I don't perform, I will be abandoned. And that terror is real for a 4-year-old child, because a child depends on their parents for literal survival. So when a child feels they will be rejected if they are authentic, they choose falsehood, because falsehood keeps their parents around, and parents around means survival. But Ethan isn't 4 years old anymore. He's 22, and his parents can't literally abandon him anymore. But the complex still operates as if he were 4 years old, as if parental rejection meant death. So the complex resists any change, because change means the risk of abandonment, and abandonment means death. Jung called this the negative paternal or maternal complex, the internalization of the critical voice of the parents that continues to operate even when the parents are no longer present. Ethan carried his mother's voice inside him. A voice that said, "You are only good if you perform." And that voice ran automatically, criticizing, demanding, never satisfying. And most people don't even realize they carry their parents' voices. They think it's their own voice, their own thoughts. But Jung showed, most of your thoughts are not your own. They are internalizations of parental voices that you absorbed in childhood and now reproduce automatically. Ethan began to realize this in therapy. Every time he thought, "I need to be perfect," the therapist would ask, "Who said that?" And Ethan would pause and realize it wasn't me, it was my mother. She never said it with words, but she communicated it with every micro-expression, every moment of approval or disapproval, every reinforcement of performance and punishment for failure. And the more Ethan questioned, the more he saw that his entire personality was built on parental programming, that he didn't know who he was without the program, that he was afraid to discover it because it would mean letting go of everything he had built. And everything he had built was based on a lie. This is what Jung called confronting the shadow. The shadow isn't just the dark side you repress, it's also the true self that you killed to survive. And confronting the shadow means recognizing that you assassinated a part of yourself, and that part is buried alive. Screaming to be rescued, Ethan was hearing that scream for the first time in 18 years, and it was deafening. But wait, because we haven't even gotten to the most important part about silent programming. And this is what you need to understand if you want to break the cycle. The programming isn't just about what parents do, it's about what parents don't do. And here Jung revealed a devastating insight. Absence is programming just as powerful as presence. When Ethan's dad ignored the dinosaur he drew, it wasn't neutral. It was an active message. Your creative expression has no value. And that message, repeated 1,000 times through micro-absences, programmed Ethan just as deeply as any obvious abuse would. And the most disturbing part, parents don't even need to be bad to program narcissism. They just need to be unconscious. They need to be dominated by their own unresolved complexes. And then they automatically transmit these complexes to the child through invisible patterns of interaction. Ethan's mom wasn't a bad person. She loved her son. She wanted the best for him, but she was being driven by her own maternal complex. A complex that said, "I only have value if my son is successful." And this complex made her use Ethan as an object for her own validation, without consciousness, without intention. just the automation of a pattern installed in her childhood. And this is generational transmission of trauma, not genetic, psychological. The grandmother had a complex, passed it to the mother passed it to Ethan, and if Ethan doesn't break the cycle, he will pass it on to his children, ad infinitum, until someone wakes up and says, "Stop, I won't repeat this." And Ethan was saying stop for the first time. But stop isn't simple, because it means dismantling the entire structure of the personality built on the program. It means letting go of the career you never wanted, the relationships based on a false self, the entire identity that was never yours, and rebuilding from scratch. Jung called this individuation, the process of becoming who you really are instead of who you were programmed to be. And individuation isn't comfortable, it's psychological death and rebirth. The inflated persona needs to die. The buried true self needs to resurrect, and the transition is chaos. Ethan stayed in therapy for 3 years. The first year was deconstruction, identifying each program, each complex, each internalized parental voice, naming it, questioning it, separating what was his from what was theirs. And it was brutal. Because the more he dismantled, the less remained. And the fear was, if I take away the program, what's left? Jung would answer, what's left is you, the true self. But the true self has been buried for so long that you don't even know what it's like. So you need to excavate through layers of conditioning until you find the authentic child who was assassinated and resurrect them. And Ethan excavated. He started small. The therapist asked Ethan, what did you enjoy doing at age 4? Before you learned you needed to be perfect. And Ethan remembered drawing, dinosaurs, no concern for quality, just the joy of creating. Then the therapist said, draw a dinosaur. And Ethan, at 23 years old, picked up a pencil and paper and tried, but he couldn't, because his mother's voice inside him said, that's a waste of time. You should be studying. And Ethan realized, I can't even draw a dinosaur without hearing her telling me to stop. And that's what Carl Jung called possession by a complex, when you can't even do a simple action without an internalized parental voice intervening. You're not free. You're a puppet, a marionette controlled by a program installed decades ago. But Jung also showed the solution. You can't kill a complex, but you can integrate it consciously. You can recognize the parental voice, thank it for keeping you alive as a child, and then consciously choose not to obey anymore. I hear you saying that drawing is a waste of time, but I don't agree, and I'm going to draw anyway. And Ethan drew, and it was terrible, disproportionate, childish, but it was his. For the first time in 19 years, he did something that didn't aim for external validation, just authentic expression. And he cried while drawing, because he was rescuing a part of himself that he had murdered at age 4. This is the process of individuation, micro acts of authenticity against the pressure of complexes, repeated thousands of times, until the true self strengthens and the complexes lose dominance. They don't disappear, but they stop directing your life automatically. The second year of therapy was experimentation. Ethan started making small choices that didn't aim for parental approval. He switched from pre-med to art, not because art was his passion, but because pre-med definitely wasn't. And he observed his mother's reaction. She panicked, called him crying, said he was throwing his future away, that she had sacrificed everything for him, that he was ungrateful. And Ethan felt overwhelming guilt, but the therapist asked, who is feeling the guilt, you or the programmed complex? And Ethan paused, and realized the complex. Because I rationally know that choosing my own life isn't ungratefulness, but I was programmed to feel that any deviation from parental expectations is betrayal, and that programming is running automatically as guilt. Jung would call it narcissistic guilt. Guilt installed by narcissistic parents to maintain control, even when the child grows up. And that guilt is a trap, because if you give in to it, you go back to the program. If you resist, it feels like you're killing your parents. But the truth is, you're not killing your parents. You're killing the program they installed. And Ethan resisted. He continued with art, and the guilt diminished over time, because he repeatedly chose authenticity over approval. And each choice strengthened his true self and weakened the complex. The third year was integration. Ethan was no longer dominated by the program. But the program still existed. Parental voices still appeared. But he recognized them. He dialogued. He consciously chose when to obey and when to ignore. And that's Jungian wholeness. Not pureness, but conscious integration of all parts. Ethan at 26 was a different person from Ethan at 22. Not because he changed, but because he finally became. He stopped being a running program and became a person living, and the difference was palpable. People around him felt it, because genuine presence has a quality that performance doesn't. And then something happened that Jung predicted. Ethan started attracting authentic people, because when you live from the persona, you attract other personas. But when you live from your true self, you attract other true selves. And Ethan, for the first time in his life, had real friendships, not based on status or performance, but on genuine connection between human beings. And he met Sarah. And Sarah was the opposite of all the women he had dated. She wasn't impressed with his achievements. She was interested in who he was when he wasn't achieving anything. And that scared Ethan, because he didn't know how to be loved for who he was. He only knew how to be admired for what he did. But Jung would say that's the difference between love of the persona versus love of the self. The persona attracts admiration. The self attracts love. And Ethan was learning the difference. Sarah saw him, not the performative version, but the real him. And being seen like that was terrifying and liberating at the same time. And here comes the deepest twist on silent programming and breaking the cycle. Ethan and Sarah had a child, Theo. And when Theo was born, Ethan felt two things simultaneously: absolute love and paralyzing terror. Terror of repeating the pattern, of programming Theo just as he had been programmed, of transforming his son into a narcissistic extension instead of a separate person. And Ethan saw that knowledge wasn't protection, because he knew all the Jungian theory. He understood complexes. He understood generational transmission. But when Theo cried at 3 a.m., for the 10th night in a row, Ethan felt irritation, and for a microsecond, he wanted to say to Theo, "Stop crying, you're being inconvenient." And then he froze, because he realized, that's exactly what my mother did to me, and I almost repeated it without even thinking. The complex was trying to run automatically, to program the next generation, but the crucial difference, Ethan noticed. He saw the complex trying to operate, and he consciously chose not to obey. He breathed, picked up Theo, validated his crying, said, "You can cry. Your needs aren't inconvenient. You are seen. You are loved for who you are." And Theo didn't understand the words. He was 3 months old, but he understood the tone, the quality of presence, and something was installed. My emotions are valid. I am seen. I exist as a separate person. And that is breaking the cycle, not perfection. Ethan still made mistakes. He still had moments where the complex ran automatically, but he noticed it quickly, corrected it, repaired it, and Theo grew up knowing something that Ethan never knew. I am loved for who I am, not for what I do, Jung said. The greatest burden a child carries is the unlived life of the parents. And Ethan decided to live his own life so that Theo wouldn't have to carry that weight, so that Theo could be Theo. Not Ethan 2.0, not a program, but a singular person with his own otherness. And you, are you living a program installed in childhood? Or are you living your own life? And if you're living a program, when are you going to wake up? You've just discovered how silent programming shapes narcissists through invisible micro-behaviors, repeated by unconscious parents. You saw how parental complexes are transmitted generationally, and how individuation breaks the cycle. Each video like this requires revealing truths that most psychologists avoid because they are too uncomfortable. That you may not be you, that your parents may have programmed you unintentionally, that your entire personality may be false. The super thanks down there isn't just financial support, that's you saying that this truth about unconscious programming needs to be known. When you click that golden heart, you help to wake up people who are still living on the autopilot of parental complexes. You're not just a spectator, you're a conscious survivor, breaking generational cycles. Now comes the practical application that changes everything. If you've recognized silent programming in your childhood, here are 3 steps based on Jung to start the deprogramming process. First step, recognize the internalized parental voice. The next time you think, I need to be perfect, I'm not good enough, I need to prove my worth, pause, ask yourself, who is saying this? Is it you or the voice of someone you absorbed? When you name the parental voice, it loses its power because it stops being your truth and becomes an installed program that you can question, as Carl Jung would advise. Second step, micro acts of authenticity. You don't need to quit your entire career like Ethan. Start small. Do one thing per week that doesn't aim for external validation, draw badly, sing off-key, exist imperfectly, and observe the resistance. This resistance is the complex fighting to maintain control. Don't give in, breathe, and do it anyway. Each micro-act strengthens your true self, as Jung's work suggests it would. Third step, tolerate narcissistic guilt without giving in to it. When you start living authentically, your parents might react. They might say you've changed, that you're being selfish, that you're disappointing them, and you'll feel overwhelming guilt. But remember, this guilt was installed to keep you obedient. It's not a sign that you're wrong, it's a sign that you're right. You're finally choosing yourself. Tolerate the guilt. It diminishes with time. And if you're a mom or dad, validate your child's emotions in real time. When your child cries, don't say stop crying. Say, I see you. Your emotions are valid. When your child fails, don't say you should have done better. Say, failing is part of learning. You are loved regardless of performance. When your child expresses a desire different from yours, don't correct them. Celebrate it. You are a separate person with your own will, and that's beautiful. This isn't coddling. It's recognition of otherness. It's treating the child as a person instead of an extension. And it's the only way to not program the next generation. Ethan is 35 years old now. Theo is 9, and Theo is everything that Ethan wasn't allowed to be. Curious without fear of error, expressive without shame, authentic without needing to perform. And Ethan observes his son and feels something that Carl Jung would call individuation through fatherhood. He's healing himself through giving Theo what he never received. And the cycle is broken, not perfectly, but consciously. And consciousness is everything, because silent programming only works when it's unconscious. When you see it, you can choose, and choice is freedom. Now tell me, did you recognize silent programming in your childhood? Team, I'm still living my parents' program. Or team, I'm deprogramming. Comment below.